For joining us tonight for Congress Park Chambers R&O meeting. As most of you know, Congress Park has been an R&O for over 40 years. We have an all-volunteer board, and we don't take positions without surveying all the neighbors that are affected. This, this meeting is recorded and it will be available on our website. Tonight, we're going to talk about a conservation overlay, which is a preservation zoning tool. And we have Libby Kaiser here from Denver Planning, and she's going to give us an overview presentation. At the end of her presentation, there's plenty of time for questions. So if everyone can let her get through the presentation, I'll call on everyone. So Libby, thank you, and go ahead.
Great. Thank you, Vicki. And I understand you've been maybe working with my colleague, Josh Palmieri, a little
Yes,
bit.
yes.
So he is out hiking the Continental Divide tonight. And so he prepared this presentation for me. And it should provide you guys with a really good overview of what a conservation overlay is all about, how much time it might take to draft one, and how it might help you preserve some of your neighborhood character. So, and as Vicki said, if y'all could hold questions until the end, we should have plenty of time. I think this presentation will take me 20, 25 minutes to get through. I will go ahead and share my screen. All right. Are you guys able to see this presentation?
Not yet.
Not yet. Here we go. Now we're good?
Perfect.
Awesome. So, Josh had relayed to me that you guys are interested in hearing about overlays and how to use them, and kind of how they work, where they fit in. And so I'll present just kind of an overview and then walk you through one of our overlays that was passed a few years ago called the Bungalow Conservation Overlay. And so a conservation overlay is a zoning tool that helps conserve certain distinctive features within a particular neighborhood. Today, there are approximately 3,000 properties that are covered by a conservation overlay, and there are a total of 8 overlays today. And so when we talk about wanting to conserve our neighborhood character through a conservation overlay or other zoning tools, we're referencing things like setbacks, which means sort of how far the house is set away from the street, or how far they're set away from each other on the sides. We're also looking at the streetscape character and the conditions of the sidewalks and the tree lawns, things of that nature. And then we also really hone in on the buildings themselves, their shape, their size, volume, their form, and as well also architectural features like porches or building materials like brick or vinyl siding. All of these things help to create the look and feel of a particular neighborhood. And so when people start to get concerned about that character changing, oftentimes it's because there's new development coming in that really doesn't match the character that the neighborhood is known for. So that might be out of scale development that just overwhelms adjacent homes. It could be incompatible forms, like big blocky homes next door to ones that have traditionally had pitched roofs. It might be incompatible materials, so seeing more kind of modern cladding as opposed to brick. And then it can also be an interruption of the streetscape character. So newer buildings might be set back closer or further from the street than buildings were historically. And that starts to kind of create a different pattern and disrupt the rhythm that previously existed in that neighborhood. And so in our zoning code, we have these conservation overlays, and they're different than a historic district, which I'll talk through in a little bit as well. But the conservation overlay, it applies different zoning standards than what exists within the underlying zoning. And the underlying zoning generally stays in place, except where modified by the overlay. One thing that a conservation overlay cannot do is it can't modify the uses that are allowed in that underlying zone district. So it really is about more the built form, streetscape character, things of that nature, and not about the uses. So graphically on the right here, you can see the underlying zone district. In this case, for example, is UTUB, which probably applies to a lot of your neighborhood. In this, it means the U means you're in an urban neighborhood. The TU means it's a 2-unit building or a duplex. And the B refers to the size of the lot. And so you would start with that, and then you'd apply the conservation overlay, and what you end up with is a mix of the regulations between the two. In here, within the UTUB zone district, there are 3 building forms that are allowed out of like 10 that are allowed across the city. Only the urban house, the duplex, and a tandem house are allowed within that 2-unit district. And then in our zoning code, it's set up with a page spread that kind of looks like this. For every one of those building forms that is allowed, in this example, we're looking at a duplex. There's graphics on the left that show visually and model what those buildings look like on a lot and give you a picture of where they are in relation to kind of neighbors, in relation to the street and the alley. And then on the right are is this table in the zoning code that includes all of the building form standards that apply to the duplex. And so it regulates such things as height, where the building is located on the lot via the front and side and rear setbacks. It also controls the maximum building coverage that's allowed on a lot, as well as parking and drive lot coverage, and where vehicles can access the lot. In this instance, with a duplex, typically in the urban kind of neighborhood context, lots are served by alleys. And so generally, if somebody was going to develop a vacant lot or redevelop an existing lot, they could only access their lot from the alleyway and having a garage off the alley. They couldn't just like build a new curb cut from the front of the lot off the street. So that's some of the things that are dictated in this table as well. There's these design elements that describe whether or not an attached garage is allowed, whether rooftop or second story decks are allowed. It also regulates an upper story setback. So the maximum height for a duplex in this UTUB district is 30 feet tall. But if you have a building that has a flat roof on it, then that can only be as tall as 25 feet before it has to be pushed back away from the street 10 feet, and then it could rise to 30. And that helps kind of minimize the mass along the street. So those are just some of the things that we regulate in the underlying base zone district. And then this is that same table just zoomed in so you can actually kind of read some of what's in there. On if we look at this UTUB, like I said, it's a 30-foot maximum height, which also equates to 2.5 stories in the front or just 1 story in the back. And then we also have a bulk plane that basically defines how far up the walls can go vertically before they have to slant in order to reduce the overall bulk of the building again. And then, in this case, the zone lot size is also defined as 4,500 feet, and zone lot width is 35 feet. Those things would be unlikely to change with the conservation overlay. Those are kind of just basic rules established for the base zone district. But then some things that might change would be the setbacks that are allowed. And so in this example, the setbacks are generally the same, whether a lot is narrower than 40 feet or wider than 40 feet, except that a slightly smaller side setback is allowed for those narrower lots. And then my colleague Josh found this picture and just really wanted to point out that even if a home can meet all of these zoning standards, it doesn't mean that you're going to get a great outcome. So we still don't regulate the style or like an architectural kind of theme. So you can you can still meet zoning regulations and still kind of end up with something funky. So now I'll talk through kind of the different tools that could apply in your case in a neighborhood where you're interested in preserving some of your unique character. And so on the left, we've got the standard rezoning. It may just be that there are certain properties that aren't zoned appropriately in your neighborhood, and there might be another underlying base zone district that would be a better fit. Maybe if you didn't want to allow like apartments on corners and felt like that was starting to break up some of the character in the neighborhood, you might consider rezoning those. And in doing that, you basically change like the underlying rules that apply to that property. So, for example, you might not have like a UTUB, you might go to like a urban single unit district that allows less intensity. If that doesn't seem right, then there's the conservation overlay, which establishes zoning tools that encourage conservation of distinctive features or architectural features within the neighborhood. There's also the possibility of creating a historic district, and that would create a whole new design review process to ensure that new buildings and changes to existing buildings preserve the historic character of the neighborhood. So each tool functions a little bit differently. Within a standard rezoning, that does allow for changing the permitted uses in the zone district. So you might go from like a residential zone district to a commercial zone district that would allow much more intense types uses. And then it also changes the standards that apply to the individual buildings that are allowed within the zone district. Alternatively, a conservation overlay. While it doesn't allow you to change the uses overall in the zone district, you can modify the certain kind of regulations that are attached to those uses. You can also choose which of the building form standards you want to modify in order to maintain a certain character. And in doing so, you could include new restrictions or fewer restrictions on the building form, as well as where the building's located on the site, the materials that are used, and any kind of specific architectural features you wanted to enhance. And then a historic district, it functions by designating properties that exist in a neighborhood. They're designated as is, and those designated properties then become subject to design review, where we have folks review them under the design guidelines for Denver landmark structures and districts that applies across the city. And if a historic district is designated, then it does discourage demolition of designated properties, but it also makes property owners eligible for state tax credits. And then, as far as what each tool doesn't do, with a standard rezoning, it does not prevent demolition, um, and it doesn't approve a site-specific development plan. Any kind of site development plan would still go through a standard review process in the city. And if that plan is determined to meet the underlying zone district standards, then it would get approved. A conservation overlay, as I mentioned earlier, doesn't change the uses that are allowed in the underlying zone district. It also does not add a new review process or create like a new review board or commission that would review any development plans submitted to the city. It also doesn't prevent demolition. A historic district, it also does not change the uses that are allowed in the underlying zone district. It also does not necessarily like implement zoning requirements, such as a specific height limit, as that would still be left to the zoning standards. And then it doesn't require design review for any work that's done on the interior of a historic property. It also does not dictate what exterior paint colors can be used on a building, or it doesn't prohibit general maintenance of a property either. And then there's certain criteria that apply to each of these different tools. So if a property owner is seeking to rezone their property, then in order for staff to recommend that that rezoning be approved, they have to find that that rezoning is consistent with the city's adopted plans, like Blueprint Denver or the comprehensive plan. They also have to find that the rezoning will ensure that the regulations associated with that zone district are applied uniformly across the zone district. And in all instances, rezonings must be found to protect the public health, safety, and welfare. And then there's also like one or two instances that also has to be applied in order to recommend approval of a rezoning. And that includes that the rezoning itself is justified because a neighborhood is changing, and that it also be consistent with the overall neighborhood context that it's in. As I mentioned, when we use the UTUB example, and what's probably applicable to much of your neighborhood is that it's within the urban neighborhood context. The city also has urban edge neighborhood contexts and suburban neighborhood contexts that are more out on the fringes of Denver. So then looking at the criteria for the conservation overlay, it is intended to contain distinctive building features and or distinctive site planning features, which relates to where the building is located on a property. And then it could also apply to distinctive natural features, if that's relevant. In order to apply that tool, still kind of like the rezoning, it has to be consistent with adopted plans. It has to ensure that regulations are applied uniformly across a district, and it still has to protect the health, safety, and welfare of the public. Then with a historic district, in order to apply historic designation, that one is intended to maintain an area's historic and physical integrity. Um, and it does that by ensuring that it's preserving special history, architecture, and or geography. And it needs to relate to a historic context or theme within one of those categories. And then as far as who can initiate any of these tools, a historic district is kind of the most permissive tool that the public can initiate. It can be either 3 people who live or own a business in Denver could try to get something designated as a historic district or historic property, or a property owner within the area, but also city council, the executive director of community planning and development, or other city agencies. And those top 3 also apply to conservation overlays as well as design overlays, which design overlays are a slightly different tool that would be used in an area of the city where they're not necessarily trying to preserve certain features so much as trying to create certain features. A few years ago, I worked on a design overlay for the Cherry Creek East neighborhood, where they really wanted to improve their pedestrian environment. And so that was a design overlay. It was trying to change towards something that they thought would be a better outcome. And then for a standard rezoning, it's either city council, the executive director of community planning and development, or a property owner that owns at least 51% of the area that can apply for a rezoning. And the typical timeline for conservation overlays, generally we recommend, if you want to move forward with it, allowing yourself 1 to 2 years to really identify what the issues are, what the opportunities are, what really is special about your neighborhood that you want to try to conserve. And and those have to be elements that can be conserved via the zoning code still. We typically try to, when we create new conservation overlays or design overlays, we still follow that same format that I showed earlier, where you would show models of the buildings and what they look like on their properties, and then you would have a table associated with that that would identify what all the standards are. And so once the neighborhood has decided what's really important to them, then they turn that over to the city, and city staff then actually puts that into technical language that would go into the zoning code using some of our standard language that we use to describe building form and how buildings are cited on a lot. So you won't have to worry about trying to learn zoning code in order to convey what your desires are to be included in that framework. Some caveats to this timeline include kind of how long it takes for the neighborhood to agree on what they think is important and what features should be conserved. It can also complicate things if the size of the area is really big and there aren't a lot of cohesive features that exist across that entire area, such that it's easier to really hone in on what you're trying to preserve. And that really hints at kind of the next bullet too, is how many numbers or how many issues you're trying to address and how complex the framework could be. It might be that there's just 4 really important things that you guys think you need additional standards for. And that would certainly move along quicker than if there were 10 or 15 things that you wanted to focus on. In addition, what can help make this process go smoother is if you have access to professional resources. Maybe there's an urban planner or an architect that lives in your neighborhood that could help kind of guide you through the process, help you understand the right terminology of what you're trying to call a particular building feature. And then there's also the availability of city council as well as planning staff can help speed up or kind of delay the time frame as well. And even while in this 1 to 2 years in the beginning, while the neighborhood's trying to figure out what's important to them, just as I'm doing now and just as Josh has been doing, we're happy to continue to have that discussion and help you evolve what the direction that you're looking to go to before we're trying to draft the zoning language. And then I'll just go over one conservation overlay that's already in the zoning code called the bungalow overlay, and how that helped to preserve certain features in the Berkeley area. So this was an overlay that was initiated several years ago by an RNO that felt that new development was really incompatible and started threatening the character of their neighborhood. The Berkeley Regis United Neighborhood, or Berkeley Regis United Neighbors, also started digging into kind of what the issue was, and eventually they reached out to their council representative, as these overlays do need to be sponsored by a council member. And then they also established a neighborhood task force to start investigating and exploring the issues and potential solutions. And here's where that overlay applies in Northwest Denver. It covers 353 properties over approximately 73 acres. And here's a sample of some of the homes in those neighborhoods. And some of the characteristics that they really wanted to preserve was the fact that a lot of the homes were only 1 and 2 stories. They had pitched roofs. They were generally smaller size, had modest footprints. There was a prevalence of front porches along the homes. A lot of them had raised foundations with basements. And then they also had generous side setbacks, which means they had more width in between the homes. And so when redevelopment started to happen in the neighborhood, as you can see in some of these models, there were concerns with just the scale and the massing of some of these new buildings that were starting to overwhelm the traditional homes. There was this kind of disruption along the streets of the street character started to lose its rhythm over time. And then there were, as the underlying zoning allowed taller buildings and flat roofs, these really kind of started to overwhelm what was next to them. And also you could have like these rooftop decks or second story decks kind of overlooking your neighbors that started to impact the quality of the neighborhood. And so as the folks around Berkeley started thinking through what they wanted to achieve with the conservation overlay, they settled upon these objectives to ensure that future development is compatible in scale and massing with existing buildings. That future development also reflected the wide side setbacks that people had enjoyed in the neighborhood for years, and continue to maintain 1-story elements along the street, like the front porches that were really prominent. And then they also wanted to mitigate the impact of those upper level kind of rooftop decks on adjacent properties while still maintaining some design flexibility. And so here's, I'll go through just a few examples of how they achieved those objectives. And related to the scale and massing, while the base zoning allowed buildings to be 30 feet high and 2.5 stories, the overlay actually brought that 30-foot height down to 28 feet if you had a pitched roof, and all the way down to 22 feet if you had a low slope or flat roof. And then alluding to the fact that a lot of them did have kind of raised foundations and basements, they decided to require that the street level floor be raised a minimum of 12 inches, where the base zoning was totally silent. There was no associated regulation for that. So you can see that a building, as shown on the right, would no longer be allowed under the conservation overlay, whereas it could have been allowed before. And then this helps to illustrate that bulk plane where in the underlying zoning beforehand, you could go vertically up with the wall 17 feet before you had to start uh, angling inwards towards the center of the lot. And they felt like that was still, it was too much and not compatible with existing buildings. So they reduced that starting point to 14 feet. And then also to help promote kind of redevelopment that still mimicked some of the smaller footprints that existed throughout the neighborhood, they set a maximum square footage of 3,000 square feet for homes that were developed on lots where the lot itself was less than 7,000 square feet. And again, this was something that didn't exist in the underlying zoning. And then finally, they also required front porches. And it's not enough just to require them. They actually came up with standards associated with those front porches to ensure that to a certain extent they mimicked what had existed historically. And so they defined a minimum square area of 48 square feet. The porches have to be at least 6 feet deep and they have to be covered by a roof that is only as tall as 18 feet. And then they also required a certain percentage of brick on the front and sides of the homes. And then Josh had thrown these in here. I don't know if you guys are considered like just Congress Park or also South City Park. Um, but he had a few photos of some buildings in the area and showing how a lot of them have pitched roofs and similar setbacks from house to house, as well as the heavy use of brick and front porches. And yet, depending on kind of the area that you're thinking of honing in on, there can be more variety within the neighborhood than was shown in the previous picture. And so it can be a little tough to identify kind of what features across the board you really want to focus on. And with that, I will stop sharing and open it up for questions.
Libby, thank you very much. That was hugely, hugely helpful. Um, if you raise your hand, I'm happy to call on you. No one has a question?
There we go.
John.
Yes, thanks for your presentation, Libby. It was great, very informative. Curious, what is the bar or the benchmark for agreement within the neighborhood to move forward with an overlay?
We don't have a city standard for what that would be. That would be, I don't know if you guys have already kind of developed some ground rules, rules of conduct, how you define, what the overall voice is of the neighborhood, but really that's up to you guys to decide. It might be through sending surveys out to folks to ask them what's important to them. Once you have that framework determined after a year or two of digging into this, maybe resurveying residents and or business owners to see if they think that you really got it right, um, and documenting any of that kind of outreach that you've done as well so that you can make the case to your city council sponsor and to the city that you feel like this is something that the neighborhood really stands behind.
Yeah, that goes to my follow-up. So our council person would really be the point person for advancing something like this. Is that correct?
They um they would have to sponsor it before staff would begin taking that next step of drafting the zoning language. Um, but you don't necessarily. I mean, it'd be a good idea for them to know that you're going to be undertaking this effort. But they're not necessarily going to be involved in like the day-to-day consideration of what features you guys want to focus on conserving. And
And
that's which district are you guys in?
we're in Chris Hines,
Okay.
and I have had a couple of meetings with him around this, and he has donated money as well to help fund outreach. So we currently have council support.
Awesome.
Um, Wendy, you had your hand up. Thanks,
Yeah,
John.
I just had a couple of questions, maybe not quite all related. It seems like the survey information from Historic Denver would be really helpful in this process. Do you think that's what other groups have used?
I don't know what other groups have used, but yeah, that does sound like a great spot to start that would um, already kind of tell the story about what's special about the neighborhood.
Oh, great, thank you. And then also, do you have any kind of summary or something of what other groups have used for their standards for agreements?
For as far as how to like document that there's wide agreement across a neighborhood.
Yeah.
I do for the
Like,
Cherry Creek East design overlays that I worked on, where it was really again led by the RNO, and they did survey residents and business owners and developers, and they put together basically a summary of the survey results.
yeah, great. Because it seems like it would be easier to follow a model than reinvent the wheel. So that's always handy.
Yeah, I'd be happy to share that with you, and I can ask folks that have worked on some other overlays if they have anything like that that they could share. Um, yeah, I agree. Examples are always helpful. I wouldn't say that you would need to follow Cherry Creek East example, right? If there's a different format that works for you, but I can send that
Right.
over.
And then I wondered if we could get a copy of your presentation from tonight.
I did send it to Vicki
I
earlier.
have it.
Oh, super. Great. Well, thanks very much, Libby. That was a great presentation.
Good. I'll tell Josh.
Carmen, you had your hand up. Do you still have a question?
Actually, I think when these questions, aligned with what I was planning to ask, I was looking more for maybe number one, the presentation, a copy of the presentation, and number two, I was thinking like the example that it was displayed in Berkeley. It's a perfect example. There's a lot of similitudes with our neighborhood, so I was thinking maybe a data sheet or something that could help us to start with a basis for having these discussions in terms of what we want to select as this is important for us, this is what we want to preserve. It would be ideal.
And if it would be helpful, I think Josh is back in a couple of days. And I could maybe have him send you like the actual excerpt of that conservation overlay from our zoning code to you guys. So you just kind of have a couple pages that you can reference as you're considering this one. And I would even encourage you to consider whether or not that one could be directly applicable to your neighborhood, because that's also an option as well, is just using that conservation overlay.
Um, I'll step in here for a minute and kind of share with neighbors how we got to this meeting. There is a neighborhood group that has been meeting for over a year, considering different preservation tools like Libby presented. A historic district is a very, very heavy lift. Um, and I and others have met with Josh a couple of times, and I've also met with designers and leaders that worked on successful and unsuccessful attempts at an overlay. Um, Congress Park Neighbors, RNO, has worked to support this, and we plan to move forward with a series of surveys and neighborhood town meetings. The town meetings are what Libby or Josh or a planner can come to and attend, and we'll have graphics. Libby, your graphics are great for people to be able to see what could happen. The unintended consequences are what we're looking to avoid. And everyone loves our neighborhood, and trying to preserve the things that are important. So surveys will help us to sort that out. I would encourage everyone that came to please share this video. Maggie, go
Well,
ahead.
I just have a couple of comments. To your comment, Libby, South City Park is a different neighborhood for us. Colfax is the delimitation of it. So what South City Park has is a microcosm of what Congress Park has. In other words, our larger homes are from Colfax through 13th. And then we start going down into the bungalow portion, just so you're aware of that. The other comment I had is that these neighborhood organizations that have applied and successfully created conservation overlays, they've put out some wonderful things as far as YouTube. And I'll put them on our webpage and we'll start sending them out. Harkness Heights had a great presentation that they gave to INC, and that's been filmed and put out on the website. Also, I'm trying to think what that it's not small, but a neighborhood organization over in Paul Cashman's group that is mid-century modern, that was created into a conservation agreement.
Krishana Park.
Yes, we do have some of that information out on our website, so we'll be sharing that so you have more. And Libby, thanks so much. You did a great presentation. It really does include everything I think that we would like to have.
Good to know. Like I said, Josh put it together, so I will certainly pass those compliments along.
There are several conservation overlays that are out there, and Maggie is correct. The INC presentation is very informative as well. This is a process. We have to reach out. Libby, I'm sorry there weren't more people here tonight, but a lot of people watch our meetings recorded. So it will get spread more than the folks here tonight. And we do have a core group that's working, and Discover Denver is an incredible asset, a gift. 2,400 properties, I think, were surveyed in Congress Park. So we have a clear collection of existing features, characteristics, block patterns to aid us. Does anyone else have any other questions? John?
Yeah, two questions. When was the Berkeley, the bungalow conservation overlay, when was that enacted?
I do not know the answer to that offhand.
22,
2022?
2022.
Okay.
Um, I think I
What,
have it, John. I'll send it to you.
okay. Um, Libby, what, if any, kind of feedback have you gotten from the neighborhood as a result of this? Or what has CPD seen in terms of permitting and project scope? Has it been successful or?
As far as related to the results of the bungalow conservation overlay,
Yes.
that's a great question, and I don't know, since I am just filling in with Josh and haven't followed that process. But I will pass that question along to him because I think it would be great to understand kind of some lessons learned from that if you think that this one is applicable to you all.
Okay. Yeah, that'd be terrific. I'm also wondering, uh, are there or is there a template or are there specific requirements, guides that the city has for the RNOs for going through a process like this? So when it comes to in other words, what you're looking for from graphics and narrative, background information, etc.
Not that I'm aware of. I've seen kind of every group take a different approach to it. And it also depends kind of on how involved the council member is. It depends on whether or not, like, previously when I worked on the Cherry Creek East design overlay, they had also gotten some funds from their previous council member, and they hired a couple of consultants to get them through the process. So everyone is just kind of unique depending on the resources within your neighborhood. But I will ask around to see if there's any guides or just kind of best practices, applications that might help you guys be most efficient in how you pursue this.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks again.
Sure.
Libby, thank you so much for your time.
Absolutely.
And Josh, have a great trip. Uh, So I want everyone to look for surveys and posts on our website, and we'll be reaching out in other ways as well. Our next neighborhood meeting is October 17th, but you will be hearing from us before then around this topic. So thank you, everyone, for coming. And please reach out to Congress Park neighbors if you have any comments or questions around this. And have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thanks for the great meeting, Vicki.